So over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about wishes, and specifically the fact that we all have them, and that wishes are something that is kind of common to the human experience, but a lot of times we kind of get stuck not getting where we want to go. And so we were talking about that we used to, when growing up, you get these postcards from people from amazing places. They would say, oh, we wish you were here. And we're like, yeah, I know. It kind of feels like a humble brag, right? We wish we were there too. And so over the past couple weeks, we've actually been talking about what our wishes were. And it's been fun for me to hear some of you filled out cards in the lobby for me. And some of them are really silly. Like, for some reason, a lot of you all have wishes about me. Like, somebody wishes I'm going to grow a beard this summer. It's not going to happen. I don't have the follicles for that, I guess. I don't know. I'm sorry. Some of you all have really serious wishes, though. So somebody wished they would get a girlfriend. We're praying for you for that, whoever you are. Somebody wished that their family would be more unified this summer. So praying for you for that, too. Gosh, I know what that feels like, to be in a place where your family's just not on the same page. That's hard. These desires of our hearts that we seem to face that we just wish would happen, and some of them are in our control or some of them are beyond our control, but we kind of see a place where we are, right, and we see a place we want to be. We all have a wish you were here, and we can define here really well. We can kind of see it, and we know what it looks like, and it's really clear what could be, but for some reason we're just stuck at the wish. We find ourselves stuck at the wish. I wish that was right. I wish it was that way. I wish it would happen, but it's just not. And sometimes these wishes are things that are really, deep things, like we've been talking about with family or finances, or I don't know, a lot of different places. But what we've been trying to figure out is, what does it take to get from wish to here, right? How do we go from being stuck with this is hypothetical to this is really a reality in my life? And the big thing that we talked about in week 1 was the fact that we all might be surprised that God has a wish for your life too. So while we're sitting back going, I wish my finances were better, I wish my relationship with my spouse was stronger, I wish that, I could get in shape, or I wish my health was better. God has wishes for our lives too. In fact, He has things and hopes. He has hopes and probable futures and hopeful futures for each and every one of us. And so I asked you to wrestle with a really hard question in week 1 and really wrestle this dangerous kind of question, which is, what does God wish for me? What is it that God wishes for me? And I think everybody should have to answer that question. I think all of us should wrestle with that, right? There's some big questions that every human being should try to wrestle down, and I think this is a big one. What does God wish for you? And let me make sure you hear me say, what does God wish for me? He doesn't want something from you. He wants something for you. That's huge. We come at God with Him seeking a relationship with us. It's not an adversarial thing. He's wanting something for us. He's wanting to give us something. He's wanting to be a part of something for us, not the other way around. He's not trying to get us to give Him anything. And so then we started talking about, what are the reasons that we can't see that, right? Why is it so hard for us to come to grips with that? We hear these promises that God says we're His daughter, we're His son, He gave His life for us. You hear all that stuff and you're like, that's just really hard to believe that I might be worthy of such a thing. Well, the reason is we tend to see the problems of our past. You tend to see just the problems of your past when God sees the potential of your future. And there's a lot of us in this room, and a lot of us listening to the sound of my voice that just can't come to grips with the fact that they have potential for their future. And I get it. You think you've done too much. You've done too much wrong. There's been too many things that have gone wrong in your life, and you're just like, there's no way there's any potential for where I am. And all you can see is the messes of your past. But God doesn't see that. God's not pacing the floors of heaven going, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this one? God knows. He has a plan, and He has a potential and a hopeful future for each and every one of us. We just don't see it the way that He does. And so at the end of, last week, we talked about this kind of statement that we all needed to come to grips with. And when we can see us the way God sees us, we can believe what God says. We got to be able to believe what God says, and the only way to do that is to see us the way God sees us. How can we look at ourselves the way God looks at us? How can we look in the mirror and go, that is a precious son, precious daughter of God? What will get us there, right? And then we started kind of unpacking some of the reasons that doesn't happen. And last week was the big one I gave you was this word, insecurity. The reason that we have so much trouble and the reason we carry our past forward with us is because we're kind of insecure. Many of us are. And these insecurities are well-founded in a lot of us. Some of you all experienced abuse, hardship, difficult relationships. People looked at you and called you worthless. There's been a lot of stuff that happens in our lives that causes us to feel insecure. And all those insecurities are well-founded. They're just not what God sees in us. And God sees such potential in you that you're not capable of seeing. And one of the things he wants for you is to see you the way he sees you. And again, when we can't, it kind of keeps us from moving forward. We get stuck in our past. And so we see this like hopeful future. We see this wish of like we wish our life was like this, but we can't possibly imagine getting there because of the way we perceive ourselves. So insecurity is a big deal. Now, there's another reason. This is the one I want to kind of drill down on this week. This is a big one, okay? It's one of those you don't like to hear about. It's one of those that's going to make you squirm in your seats a little bit, but it's something that we all have to wrestle with. The reason we often don't make it into our potential hopeful futures is because we just can't control ourselves. We can't. We can't control ourselves. In other words, we lack self-control. We lack self-control. We don't have the ability to go, you know what, I shouldn't do that, and then not do it. For example, all right, let's give a silly one. This is why so many of us who say, you know what, I'm going to get in shape and I'm going to join the gym, and my New Year's resolution this year, I'm going to get in there, I'm going to work out, I'm going to work really, really hard, and then, you can't keep yourself going. You can't keep yourself going back to the gym. The whole thing with the fact that a habit actually takes 14 days to form. It takes 14 days for a habit to set itself up in us, right? It only takes 2 to break it. It takes 2 days to break a good habit you formed that took 14 days to coalesce. And that's a big deal, okay? Because that's why in that gym time and you hit Friday and you did leg day and you walk out of the gym and your legs feel like wet spaghetti and you're like, I just can't do this anymore. And then Monday comes and that alarm goes off for you to go back to the gym and you say something like, you know what? I just owe myself this break. I worked so hard last week, it's going to be fine. And then the next day rolls around, and you're like, you know what, I can't not walk in this meeting at work today. And then before too long, you are out of that habit again because you can't control yourself. This is why some of us say things like, gosh, I just wish I could get out of debt. And then we spend money like water. Some of us say, gosh, I just wish I could rekindle and reform my relationship with my spouse. And then we make really stupid decisions over and over and over again that aren't going to get us there. Because we can't control ourselves. We haven't built guardrails. We haven't built healthy boundaries in our lives. Look, I don't know what they look like for you. I don't know what the things are for you, what the temptations are out there that are kind of sitting in front of you. But I do know that there are things that tempt all of us, and every single human being needs to learn how to have self-control. It's just not a very common skill. It's not something that a lot of us have. But what happens in our lives when we don't have self-control is our lives kind of start crumbling a little bit. So King Solomon, who was one of the wisest men who ever lived, actually talked a little bit about what our lives look like when we don't have self-control. And then the interesting thing is he just kind of drops this truth grenade, and it's a really important one, okay? It's a really great image, but he doesn't give us the whole piece of it. So I want to share this with you, and then I want to go someplace else to kind of figure out how we're going to unpack it. So here's what he says. Like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. Now think about this picture for a minute. Cities in King Solomon's day that didn't have walls were constantly pillaged. They were raided by outsiders. Their goods were stolen, and all their grain would be taken away, and their people, their cities would be burned. And so what he's talking about, these are very militaristic looking terms, but he's talking about the fact that if you don't have self-control in your life is constantly going to be raided. There's going to be something outside of you that is constantly going to be pulling at you and taking away the good from your life. Lives without self-control end up like pillaged cities. Lives without self-control, without walls to kind of guard and guardrails to keep things intact, they end up like pillaged cities. And so what's great is you go, oh my gosh, that picture makes complete sense. But then he just moves on. He doesn't tell you what to do about it. And that's okay, because I think there's a far better picture of what we can do about it, what the practical might look like, that we can find in the New Testament. And it comes from the Apostle Paul in a letter that he wrote to the Corinthians, the church at Corinth. Now, what's interesting about this is Paul is probably the perfect character to talk about self-control. Because, one, he faced many hardships once he became a Jesus follower, but two, he's actually in a really interesting situation with the Corinthians when he writes this second letter. the first letter to the Corinthians, okay, the first time he wrote to the church at Corinth, when he wrote them, he had planted the church, he'd moved on to Ephesus, he wrote them this letter from Ephesus talking about what they should do and the importance of kind of falling in line. And he was really harsh with them. He said, he told them that they had made terrible mistakes and he wanted to see them fall in line and rekindle relationships and do the right thing. And so he sent them this letter, finished up his time in Ephesus, and then decided, he kind of made the mistake to go back and visit Corinth again. This was before he wrote the second letter. So between the writing of the first and second letter, Paul goes back to Corinth, and they're so offended by him that they throw him in prison. They're so upset and so offended by what he had said to them in their letter that they put him in jail. And so Paul eventually gets out. They let him out. They say, don't ever come back to Corinth again. It's more or less what they told him. And so sometime later, he writes the second letter to the Corinthians. He writes them a letter again. And it's fascinating to me that he experienced this kind of like real rejection from them. He experienced this real like, we don't like you, we don't like what you said, kind of image from him, but he didn't give up on them. And in fact, his letter comes off very loving, it comes off very kind, it comes off very patient, and his language is carefully guarded. If you read it compared to the first one, you can see that. And I just find that fascinating because Paul didn't give up on them. And he'd ever write, like every other human being who had this happen, they go, well, the heck with you, right? And that might be what you would have done. They put me in prison when all I did was care about them. Well, that's the heck with them. But Paul was patient. He knew what God's plan was for the church at Corinth. He knew what God's plan was for him. And he was so resolute. He was so focused and so guarded and so self-controlled that he decided to stay the course even when the people he was writing to hadn't. Now that takes guts. And so if anybody's going to speak to us about self-control, I think the Apostle Paul might have some space to tell us something. So in his second letter to the Corinthians, Paul starts off kind of this idea of being able to control ourselves by talking about how internal this battle really is, that we're waging war in a way that you might not expect. And here's how it begins here in the 10th chapter. It goes like this. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. In other words, this stuff that's happening, all of these battles that are happening are internal. And he's talking about the fact that we're not fighting these battles with swords and spears and shields and things like you typically would wage war with. And it reminds me of what King David said in the Old Testament when David faced Goliath. Goliath had been taunting God all day, and he looks at Goliath, David does, and he goes, you come at me with sword and spear, weapons that I do not have, but I come against you with the power of the Lord of hosts, right? And so I don't come at you with the weapons that you're coming at me with. But Paul's even deeper than that. He's saying that this battleground for what our actions are, this battleground for what we decide to do, the battleground for self-control, if you might say, isn't actually something you fight with normal weapons. It's fought on the inside. In other words, the battle for self-control begins in the brain. The battle for self-control begins in the brain. It's before you have responded. It's before you've taken action. That's where the battle of self-control begins. He expounds on this. He continues, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. Now, I like this because, again, he's setting this up when this spiritual battle that is happening and the fact that we need divine power to overcome it. And the word he uses for power here is dunamis. And dunamis is the same word we get for dynamite. And I really like that because he's using really militaristic language, like we've got these forts, these strongholds, and God is going to give you divine dynamite to blow them up. I really like that because our temptation with these kind of thoughts or these wars is to kind of take them over and win. Paul says, no, you're going to demolish them. And you're going to do this with divine power. You're going to do this with God's help. The reason I think this is valuable is because what Paul is kind of insinuating to us, if there's some battles in your life that you need divine power to win, there are things you're going to face, addictions, bad habits, changes in your lifestyle, things you're going to need to do to change, to move in the direction God wants you to, that you can't accomplish without God's help. But he goes, I got you. I'm good. It's like God looked into his holster and he goes, I've got the perfect weapon for you in this power. How about some divine dunamis, some divine dynamite? Would that work? And we're all supposed to go, yeah, that's exactly what I need. These strongholds, right? He says, demolish these strongholds. And what he's talking about is these arguments that we kind of set up in our mind. He's going to explain this in a minute, but I want you to not miss this. we tend to just justify our actions, right? We decide we want to do something, even if it's not healthy for us, even if it's not the best thing we could do, and then we go to work in our mind saying, no, here's how I'm going to shore up this argument. Here's how I'm going to make this make sense to myself. Here's how I'm going to defend it when my friends go, dude, what are you doing? This is how I'm going to do that. We build up these strongholds, and Paul's like, you need divine power to tear those down. You need to just clean those out. Let me break it down for you with a word picture, okay? Here's how things typically work for us. We have a thought, right? We can't control all the thoughts that pop into our heads, but we have a thought. That thought comes, and then, this is college 101 psychology, okay? This is not like, anything any more than I paid attention in my first semester psychology class at UK, okay? But there's a thought, and then we respond to that thought. There's a response. This is typically the way it works for every human being. Something pops in your head, and then you choose how you're going to respond. What Paul is about to say that is so important to all of us, and as Dave Matthews has said, there is a space between. There is a space between the thought and the response, and he wants us to do something. He thinks that all the people who are following Jesus should do something, and people who want to have self-control, people who don't want their lives to look like demolished and pillaged cities, they should do something in the space between. What should we do? Well, this is what he says. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. Again, like I said a minute ago, we have this tendency as human beings to start building up arguments in our minds that will defend whatever action we were going to take. We have this idea that I know that eating unhealthy, I know I want to lose weight and I want to get myself in shape, but I've been so good. And somebody offered me ice cream, I can't just say no to that. It was a gift, wouldn't it be rude to not take it? Or I know I said I was going to go to the gym all week this week, but I just got invited out and I don't want to say no to my friends. I've said no to them before. Maybe I ought to just take a break. And it's like this slippery slope. One simple decision leads to a cascade. Or something more complicated. You know what? I know that I'm trying to quit drinking. I know that I can't control myself when I drink, and I've been really good this week, and the boys just invited me out for one drink. I can have one drink, right? I can do this. And then that leads to this slippery slope. We set up these pretensions. We set up these arguments. We set up these justification tactics in our minds. And then when the thought enters, in that space between, when the thought enters between space and response, what we're tempted to do is make that thought comfortable. We're just going to make it comfortable. Oh man, I'm so glad you're here, thought. Just sit down for just a moment and let me make you feel really comfortable. And we justify it. We take this thing that we know will hurt us. We take this thing that we know will harm us. This thought, this idea, this action, we know it's not good for us. We know it's not good for the people around us. We know it's not going to get us where we want to go. But instead of saying, you need to go, we make it comfortable. And then we respond. We justify it in our minds long enough that we say we can get away with it, or we can make it go away, or this is actually a good thing, don't worry about it. Paul says that we should have a different response. If you want self-control, if you want to be able to take control of your life again, and not have things that are bad for you control you, he says we should do this. We take captive every thought to make it obedience to Christ. Every thought, we take it captive. So, a thought comes, and before we respond to that, we take it captive. You know what this reminds me of? This is such a silly thing. This reminds me of that movie Taken with Liam Neeson. I think there's 5 of them now. But in that movie, if you've not seen it, his daughter gets kidnapped, okay? And he has this scene where he's on the phone with the kidnapper of his daughter, okay? I don't want to ruin it too much. But he knows the kidnapper's listening. They're just not responding. And so he picks up the phone, he puts it to his ear, and he goes, if you're looking for ransom, I have none. You'll get no money from me. But what I do have is a very specific set of skills that I have attained over a lifetime, skills that make me a nightmare for people like you. Now, if you let my daughter go now, no harm will come to you. I will not hunt you. But if you continue down this course, I will hunt you, I will find you, and I will kill you. It's like Paul wants us to do that through our thoughts. These thoughts enter into our minds, and they're getting ready to tell us what to do or take control or ransom us to this behavior. And we go, no, I'm in charge. Here's how things are going to go. That we be resolute, and we understand where it is we want to go, and we bring all of our thoughts captive. We make them captive and bring them into alignment, obedience with Christ. Now look, I know obedience is not a word that you really like to hear all the time. It's not a word that I like to hear all the time. But the reason Paul ties these things together is because Jesus knew what best life looked like. Jesus knew and modeled and taught what best life looks like. And so when we decide intentionally to bring our lives into alignment and into an obedience with Christ, and we bring all these thoughts and all these actions into alignment with obedience with Christ, our lives get better. And the things that we want for ourselves, the wishes that we want to attain, they start becoming more possible. So the idea is for you to take your thoughts and make them captive, right? So listen to this. We take every thought captive to make it obedient to Christ. Practically speaking, what you need to do is take your thoughts captive to rebuild the walls of control. Take your thoughts captive to restore the wall of control in your life. If you feel like you're out of control, if you feel like there's something that's controlling you more than you're controlling it, I don't know what it is. It's your money, it's an addiction, it's a substance, it's your health, it's a relationship, it's a career. I don't know. But if you find yourself in a place where something is more in control of you than you are of it, Paul says take your thoughts captive to restore your wall of control. It starts in the mind. It starts in the mind. Here's the question I want to leave you with as we kind of close this out. What are the thoughts that you need to take captive? What are the things that you need to take captive, the thoughts that constantly pop in your mind? And look, I don't want to sugarcoat this, or I don't want to make this more than it is, okay? Most of us every day are not making massive moral decisions, okay? Most of the time, the things that lead us in the direction of bad habits start off as really small things. They start off as really small, insignificant decisions that we're making. But they come on a regular basis. And then we're tempted to, if we haven't thought about it, we're tempted to give in to these thoughts. We're tempted to give in to these behaviors that later lead us in a direction we wish we weren't going. So for you specifically, okay, what are the thoughts that you need to take captive? The scripture tells us that we have an enemy. That enemy is Satan, and Satan is walking around, prowling around like a roaring lion, waiting to see who he can devour. He has an attack plan for all of us. So he's going to use a consistent line of thinking for you if you have a kink in your armor, if you have a weak place in your walls. What is it for you? If you don't know what that is, let me back up and kind of ask the question maybe in a different way. What are the thoughts that you need to take captive that result in the behaviors you're trying to avoid? What are the thoughts that you need to take captive that will result in the behaviors you're trying to avoid? You know what those are better than anybody else does. What are the thoughts that get you doing the things you wish you weren't doing? Where does it start with you? I talked to a friend not long ago who's an addict, and their temptation to use always begins with a feeling of a lack of worth, a lack of self-worth. It always begins in a place where they feel worthless. And so the thought that she needed to take over, the thought that she needed to take control of was that she would, this thought would pop in that she was worthless. She needed to take control of that. What are the thoughts that pop into your minds that lead to the behaviors that are not taking you where you want to go? And finally, let me put this question maybe in a different way finally. What are the thoughts that you need to take captive that result in the behaviors you're trying to avoid that are keeping you from the wishes for your future? That's a mouthful. That's why I put it on 3 slides rather than 1. But what are the things? What are those habits? What are those thoughts? What are those behaviors that are keeping you from getting where you want to go? And how can you take them captive and bring them into alignment and obedience with Christ? Because when you do that, your life is going to change. Paul says that battle begins in the brain. It begins in the mind. It begins inside. We're not waging war like normal people. We're not waging war with swords and spears. We're waging war in our hearts and in our minds against thoughts and strongholds. What are the strongholds you need to tear down? And if you don't know the answer to that, let me give you a silly thing to consider. You need to take time to think about what you need to think about. You need to take time to think about what you need to think about. For centuries, Christians have called this quiet time. For me, it starts in the morning. 15 minutes in the morning. 15 minutes for me every morning where I just gather together, gather my thoughts in my wits, and I just sit in silence and listen. What do I need to think about? What are the thoughts that are going to pop into my head today that are going to keep me from getting where I want to go? Look, if you just start with 15 minutes, like if you can't do 15, maybe think 5. Just start really simple and block it in every day to take time to think about what you need to think about. Because if you don't make time, you won't ever do it. If you don't set the time and be consistent, you won't ever do it. And let me just say, if you don't do this, you won't ever get where you want to go. And 5, 10 years from now, you'll still be stuck in wish rather than here. And I don't want 5 or 10 years from now for you to rewatch this message and go, I'm going to try this, and then it just becomes a religious experience where you didn't give it a shot, you didn't put anything into practice, and your life didn't change. Choose now. And finally, choose the thoughts. Choose the thoughts that result in the behaviors you wish for your future. You know the behaviors and the thoughts that lead you away from the future that you want. How can you choose thoughts to put into practice that lead you where you want to go? Let me pray for you in the middle of that. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you so much for the people listening to the sound of my voice, people here that are gathered listening to this today. I just ask that in the middle of this wrestling, in the middle of this wandering that we find ourselves doing about our wishes and our hopes, that you would just bring such clarity to us. God, what are the things that keep us from getting where you want us to go? What are the things that keep us from getting where we want to go? What are the thoughts that we need to take captive? For each of the people that are thinking about this today, would you give them the boldness and courage to not only seek those thoughts out, but take them captive and regain control in their life so they can bring them into obedience with your Son, Jesus Christ, and move towards the potential future that you wish and hope for each and every one of us. God, we love you, we praise you, we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.